say the least, as a person of color raised within the first world, within the lexicon of US exceptionalism. Undoing how I saw myself and see myself has been an intellectual endeavor as well as an emotional and psychological one. For me, the image and the documentation of my performances serve as anchors in understanding the power of the gaze and how to unwield it. I see the purpose of my artwork much like American artist Jack Whitten did, as truth and soul, as history making and not historization. Part of a living archive and a living history, actively undoing the ramifications of imperialism in the cultural objects that bear and have bared witness. The humanizing of my gaze as experience, the I and I, la potencia. And some of the artists that I continuously see myself turning to for renewal over the years have included Laura Aguilar, Adrian Piper, Ana Mendieta, Lorraine O'Grady, and Carrie Mae Weems. So upon seeing the exhibition, bear with me, we've already done enough. Hold on. Okay. So during the exhibition at the American Society, one of the images that really caught my eye was that of Liliana Porter. And it's on your screen, it should be on your left. And it reads, this woman is North Vietnamese, South African, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Black, Argentinian, my mother, my sister, you, I. And to the right of the screen are images of New York City subway system while I was growing up here. And one of the reasons why this particular work by Porter attracted me was because these memories came back of my seeing many Vietnam veterans houseless on the subway and on the streets growing up. And the Vietnam War being a very pronounced conversation, not only in political circles, because this is the time, this era is just concluding that the war ended in 1975, but also in TV, in TV series, in movies, there was always a Vietnam veteran present. There was always a conversation in the room, in that space. And also in New York City, it was the decade following the movements in the country and around the world. And the air in New York was still fecund with memories of many of the unresolved actions started by these movements and the consequences that followed the breakthroughs that these movement builders created. And the subways were stages where all this found itself. It was where the intimate and the private met in public. The subway walls and the graffiti art were sets contextualizing location and time, and nothing was hidden. Different faces, languages were consistent reminders for me growing up that a larger world existed outside of the sidewalks I lived on. And that's one of the great benefits of growing up BIPOC in New York City. It's one of the joys. It's the joy of diversity being natural and comfortable. And because of the movement building in the 60s and 70s, like how Porter is insisting in her image, or attempts to, whether it be gentle or not so gentle, these reminders that crimes against the Vietnamese people were also crimes against BIPOC people in ghettos and barrios. And all these crimes were crimes against humanity. For the simplest of reasons, that we are all kin. So looking back on the following performance series that I'm about to share with you, titled The Rule is Love, I see how informed they had been by these childhood realizations. The Rule is Love deals with undoing racial structural systems that constitute modern social conditioning, forming our epistemic foundations. And in them, I establish actions with instructions and rules I must follow, while relying on participants to complete them. The performances are meditations on what propels people to act when another person is in trouble, needs help, and or is grieving. What causes people to stop and help? Or what prevents them from doing so? The first performance in this series is titled Orange, and it was first staged on the 8th floor for the accompanying exhibition Enacting Stillness, curated by Sarah Raceman. The pragmatic setup of the performance consisted of my being blindfolded, unable to speak, unable to move my arms, while surrounded by about 3,000 tacks facing up. My rule was to keep moving, so I could never stop. Inevitably, I would step on a tack. The participants' rule was to keep me from stepping on the tack. So they had to negotiate and work amongst each other, as well as keeping an eye on me. I wore an orange jumpsuit, not a subtle reminder of thinking of the prisoner industrial complex, and also asking audience members to rethink their pre-existing thoughts or opinions on people who have been victims of the prison industrial complex. The performance lasted 2 hours nonstop. I didn't take a break. And it was also restaged again for the Korea Arts Forum about 2 years later in 2019. The second performance in this series is Say Her Name, which was first performed in 2017 and only performed, I have not restaged this, for Art in Odd Places. It's an Art in Odd Places, an annual performance happening on 14th Street, and it's been going on for the last 14 years. And this particular rendition of Art in Odd Places, Sense, was curated by Rocio Andra Alvarado. In Say Her Name, I transverse 14th Street from Avenue C to Hudson Street, and I'm blindfolded, unable to speak, while holding a green plant on my head. I'm dressed in black, and I'm dressed with a handkerchief on my head, and embroidered on it in red is Say Her Name. And this performance serves as a wake for the 80 cis and trans Black and Indigenous women killed by police violence in 2017. And those names span 6 months. So from the start of my invitation to participate and perform for Art in Odd Places, I started keeping track as much as I could, because there are many more than just 80 names of women who have been victims of police violence leading up to that date, which is in October. Participants were asked to give me directions while addressing me by one of the names of the women provided to them. So for example, a participant would say, Sarah Bland, please move 2 steps to your right and wait for the light. At the intersections, at the crosswalks, I would take a knee for the duration of the light's change. Starting out, the performance, it almost, the plant on my head almost felt different or separate from me, from my body. And although it's something that I specifically chose to carry, and I chose to carry this live object, this living and breathing object on my head, so that I could be mindful not to drop it, so I can be careful to take care of it as I transversed in this silent wailing process. And by the end of the performance, the plant seemed to be carrying me, and it became a beacon to anyone willing to partake in the procession, saying the women's names. It has become my first, most intimate experience connecting to grieving and connecting the land to grieving, and the history of land and settler colonialism practices here. The performance implied an extension of body and plant in the wake of the murdered women due to police repression and the parallels of violence committed to the land and the systemic brutality done to it in the name of civilization. The last piece I will share with you is the fourth performance of this series, The Rule is Love. And it's with gaze and no object. And it was performed in 2018 at the Brooklyn Museum as part of Radical Women Latin American Art. And it was curated by the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics by Madeleine Ramirez Cancio. And this performance series was called Cuerpos Radicales, Radical Bodies in Performance. And this performance is still a difficult one to talk about because it was informed by the act of making the psychic experience of how the gaze affects the BIPOC body in physical space. It also highlights the other side of this situation more succinctly. How does the gazer behave? What simple nudge needs to take place to activate the innate superiority enabled by what Adrian Piper describes about her Catalyst series as the feeling of being objectified over and over again by people's innate, uncontrollable fear impulses when not used to seeing BIPOC people in their environment. And in this case, the environment being the Brooklyn Museum. Museums in itself having a contested history due to the pillaging of artifacts, due to these collections, and due to colonialism. How will they react when the objectified is staged to be objectified? Will reason save the day? Or will their fear impulses cause them to behave in ways that put their discomfort on display? Will they realize what they're doing? Will they get it and prevent its happening? And what they were asked to prevent to happen was that for the staging of this performance, I was bound by my wrists and my knees, and which were attached to rope. The rope measuring about 25 feet long. And to the left of your screen, you'll see two performers, two people wearing bare masks. And each had two of these ropes in their hand. Their rule, the bears' rules, were to pull me down, to continuously pull me down forcefully onto the hard marble floor of the museum. And I was to get up. The participants' rules was to prevent that from happening by dancing with me. The music, we had live music. It was played by two Palestinian musicians who played various traditional music. One with the tabla drum. I may have the name of the drum incorrect, but very similar to a tabla drum, and the other with the violin. I also had an MC, and the MC's rule was to coax people, to get them to invite me. So the MC had this really delicate role that he played where, which mirrored very much that of a circus ring. I don't know the name of like a circus ring wrangler. Being aware that I'm on display, and I was brought out onto the setting, shrouded in a piece of fabric created by Andrea Solstad, which consisted of pieces of the American flag, jute, and also that particular blanket, that silver particular blanket that we've seen in many images of detainees at the border being given to keep warm. What's interesting about this performance, and I don't think I'll ever restage it, is that an hour in, different people were dancing with me in different ways. And if we had more time, I would share a video, but we don't, and I'm not, but for the future, of the different interactions of participants dancing with me, many of them awkwardly dancing with me. And I could not see. So I would only be able to know that someone was dancing with me when the bears stopped pulling me. But one of the interesting things, and what this image is showing you, is that somehow what happened was that some of the participants actually organized to and plotted, and this was not planned at all. They organized and plotted to get me out of the bear's grasps and to untie me. And that was, I didn't know what was going on. I was just kind of going with the flow of what I was sensing was happening, because no one was speaking to me. All I did hear from these individuals, I guess this is one of the women, was, "You'll be okay." And this was towards the conclusion of the performance, where they very gently laid me down on the floor of the museum. And after having untied me, and the MC, with all the theatrical, like improvisational instincts that he had, took the shroud that I had come in with and covered me. And it was impactful for all of them to witness, and for the remaining participants in the hall to witness as well. And I'll conclude this by saying first, thank you, and also by just asking a question that I often ask myself as I create my work and I think, and I'm really grateful for panels like this because it offers me the opportunity to rethink. You know, you're preparing for your show, or your panel, sorry, it's not a show. You're preparing for this talk, and at the same time revisiting ideas, and it's always an evolving process, because as we evolve as artists, as we evolve as human beings, because you can never separate the human being from the artist, and engaging in the current context of our environment, and looking at one's work and how that plays into this larger dialogue that one hopes will continue on as being an object of reference, a point of reference, when we step back and see this time, this part of the 21st century. So one of the questions that just came about last night and a few days, and which I've just often reflected on, is how are we radically transforming the inequality and the inconsistencies of our present life when time is running out? How do we get this right? And how will we come out on the other side of it? So thank you very much.
So, hello, yes. So now we're gonna go to Mary Valverde. Thank you so much for that great presentation, Alicia. Hello, Mary. Thank you.
Hello,
You have the floor.
how's everyone? I'm going to share. Good morning, Mary Valverde. I'm honored to be joining the panel and this discussion. I was born in Queens, New York. I'm a first-generation New Yorker from Ecuadorian parents who migrated to New York City in the 70s. I'm 46 now, so my New York City artist experience grew from growing up here in the 80s and going to college in the 90s. I wanted to say that my cousin Hamlet Zurita, who was a painter, and his life partner Carmen Valle, a poet and professor here in New York City, were so excited when they found out I was going to go to art school that they invited me to every exhibition and poetry reading they knew about during that time. While I was in art school, I met my good friend Whitfield Lavelle, who was my professor at the time and who shared job and exhibition opportunities. They were all genuinely excited to share their art world with me. And I point this out because it is super important to acknowledge how Latinx artists and all artists of color in New York City survive, often create New York City art culture through community and sharing their access and opportunity with each other. For me, being an artist is not just producing artwork, it is also essential to archive and share cultural works. Our work and support for that work is needed to build on our collective histories and culture we already have, and the ones that we choose to value, and hopefully that becomes broader and more connected. With that in mind, I wanted to start with this image. It is a composite of several reference images that I have that have inspired me in some of my most recent projects and research. I consider myself, as Aimé said, a cultural practitioner with a focus on visual arts and research. Traveling with my family to diverse communities in Ecuador, as well as recent visits to New Orleans, Louisiana, and my experience seeing the American Indian Institute in New Mexico fostered an investment in researching the cross-sector of influence and exchange between Indigenous and African communities in the Americas. I center my work and research as a visual artist on the historical and present-day connections between Indigenous and African communities in the Americas, specifically the effects of those histories, the ongoing evolution, the adjustments, inventions, and shifts of culture, visual arts, and language. How we speak, how we keep, how we modify and adjust our visual culture to maintain and acknowledge our roots through the abstraction of traditional systems, the use of patterns and codes. The language of mathematics, geometry, and science is imprinted in the rhythms of our textiles, our speech, and our organized spaces. So my work reflects and responds to my research of how these patterns and rhythms interact and are composed. So I'm currently the artist in residence at the Latinx project at New York University. This piece, Adornment Marks, is one of 3 projects I'm exhibiting in my solo show encoded Marks and Winding Paths, and it's curated by the brilliant curator, Eva Mahabal Davis. This piece is about 6 feet square in this space, installed on top of a blue circle. It is a draped canvas that has a series of patterned incisions and marks in brown, red, and white. Like most of my installation works, it is meant to be reconfigured and reinstalled in response to the space. So in theory, it can expand and contrast depending on the wall or the space provided. The work is inspired by markings and body adornment. These are double-sided panels made of connected modules. Each board is painted in a pattern and palette inspired by pre-Columbian textiles. Red, brown, and yellows on one side, and on the underbelly, more organic gestural gold marks. The panels are independent of each other, so the pieces can peek and fold in distinct arrangements to create connections between the connecting panels, forming different patterns, different shadows, and passages. I often get invited to present my installation works, large-scale installation works, so I was really excited to be able to share my works on paper through this exhibition. These are a series of oil on paper works, 12 by 16 each. I find myself making drawings all the time, sometimes to investigate those same patterns and to work through ideas. There are a total of 12 in this series, but there are 10 right now in this layout. This image is of a large-scale installation titled Huaca. The wall portion is made of painted paper individually incised with circular cutouts to fold out at an angle with consideration to the viewer. It is embedded with the pattern of the Chacana symbol, which is the Incan cross. This geometric symbol is found in many places in pre-Columbian culture, including jewelry, architecture, and textiles. The floor piece had ornate gold marks, and the boards are installed in a pattern inspired by tile work found in the Huaca de la Luna in Peru. This piece is titled Curves and Points. This piece is comprised of 9 separate panels of connected painted bamboo with string. Each panel has 45 individual painted bamboos, brown and white dashes on both sides. They collectively create an arrangement that utilizes the innate qualities of the bamboo to create a form that bows and curves and bends. So depending on the anchor of the pieces and the space in between each panel, the piece can be walked under and experienced by many different vantage points. So the dashes seem to move and overlap like drawings in space. This is the last piece I'm going to share. This is a large scale acrylic on masonite piece. The overall design is inspired by the Chacana symbol, and each piece is meant to function as an individual module, modules that are puzzled to create this combined design. When I make work inspired by these symbols and these patterns, I'm communicating with a community that understands this specific vernacular, that is familiar with these visual cues and patterns. If you're not familiar with them, with this language, my work can also be read formally. I utilize these patterns to create work that offers a space for contemplation and to offer an opportunity to remember this visual language. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary. We're not going to go straight to Elia. We have Glendalis trying to join, but she might present last. Elia, if that's okay, we'll go with you. Your presentation.
And there we go. Okay, I'm going to share now.
Thank you, Elia. It's a pleasure to have you.
I have to do this twice, unfortunately, for whatever reason. Hold on one second. Full screen mode. Okay, stop share. Sorry about this, folks. All right, let's see here. Now we're sharing. Yay. Okay. Hi, thank you so much, Aimé and Arlene, for having me here, and the American Society, of course. I'm going to talk about 2 specific projects because I felt they really connected with this aspect of community that Aimé was speaking about early on in her presentation. Because regardless of how some of these groups were formed, they really came at a time where, yes, it was a hotbed for creativity, but there was also other things going on. So I normally like to read a little bit and ad lib as I go along. So that's what I'm going to do. So the project that you're seeing now, and I'm going to show you a few slides from that, is the Larry Levan project. So I'm going to give you a little background information. Disco is one of the most misunderstood musical genres. Thought to be musically vapid, it was far from it. It was a world away from glitter balls and polyester suits. Disco presided over a time of social change in the late 60s and 70s. We had the war in Vietnam, as it was mentioned before, the oil crisis too, and there was a deep economic recession. New York City was very, very devastated, and many fled to the suburbs. But there also was not a lot of help for people that were staying behind within all this stuff. So the disco, more than just a venue for inciting party music, it was actually became like a safe space for marginalized groups, especially those in the Black, Latino, and LGBTQ plus communities. Disco's roots were utopian, radical, subversive, and political. Its songs were about spreading love, getting together, sanctuary, making the world a better place, but also too singing about the ills that people were going through at the time. And you find that very much in the early 70s. So the disco message for me was about empowerment and inclusion. And its backlash at that time was anti-gay, anti-queer, anti-woman, anti-color. Disco enabled queer, Black, and Latinx people to define their identities in increasingly fluid ways. Disco wasn't just a music, it was actually a movement. At least I see it that way, and I think others do too. I mean, interestingly enough, even to this day, disco is not afforded the same cultural reverence as rock and roll or punk, yet its revolutions have been far-reaching and have influenced music, fashion, culture to this day, and for me, the blueprint for solidarity. Now, as I mentioned, I came, or as it was mentioned in my bio, my parents came here in the 50s. So I am going to be turning 60 this year, and I was relatively young. So I was, in my maybe 12 or 13 when disco started to happen. But it was also the music I was listening to, and that was like part of me coming of age in New York. So disco also was the era when the DJ came of age. They became the god to their dance floor. This photo series that I'm showing you now utilizes the image of the important figure in DJ culture called Larry Levan, who for more than 10 years held court at the equally legendary New York nightclub Paradise Garage. I created masks of Larry's face and through a photo transfer process on fabric for performers to wear. The participants were then photographed during a few nights in small clubs in the Bronx. Through the mask, the performers, or models, if you will, and the DJ become one. Larry Levan's images, or Larry Levan, the DJ itself, his sessions at Paradise Garage were dubbed Saturday Mass. And I think it was like a name that reflected a lot the idea of a weekly ritual, but also the idea of sanctuary. And, I think these kinds of spaces still exist, where queer folks of color, Black and Latinos kind of come together and not only dance, but find a place where they can talk about, where they are in life, but also find community. And I feel like that is one of the most important parts of disco. That's why when I talk about this project, a lot of people think of it as a homage to Larry Levan. Well, I think I skipped a few. Wait. Talks about a homage to Larry Levan, but really, this is what he looked like. But really, it is a conversation on disco as a movement, and actually like the kind of things that I am always been considered it. Communities, how do communities come together? As Alicia mentioned, we were going through the Vietnam War, but we were also going through gay liberation. We were also, we were coming out of the women's movement, even though that movement didn't include women of color, but it nonetheless created a sense of freedom. And so you had this sense of freedom mixed up with all this turmoil. And in that, these kinds of movements were born. So here, and this is a project I did fast forward like 10 years later, where I created an environment for people to come in just off the street and dance. We had refreshments, and we had a rotating set of DJs coming in. And what I did was, the photographs and the masks that people wore were set up like props. And then there was a video that I did, and the video was going. So it all was to kind of think about that era, but also think about this important figure in DJ culture. This now is going to make me segue to the Supper Club, which I think really as well, again, is thinking about community. The Supper Club itself started off with this idea of me wanting to photograph my artist friends of color, because in 2012, there wasn't in regular magazines, you know, in glossies, or however you want to call them, in like Vanity Fair, Vogue. I mean, I think you see more now. There wasn't enough artists not artists, there just wasn't people of color on covers of magazines. Even though in 2012 we had a Black president, it was, you know, it was almost like the complete opposite of what was going on. Thinking, you know, the idea was we have a Black president, well, we should have more representation, but that simply was not the case. So I asked all these people if they wanted to be part of this project. And one of the things that I thought was important to consider was their voices. And I'll talk a little bit about how I came up with the portraits. But one of the things that I wanted to do, I wanted to photograph them. And then I decided, well, I need to contextualize who they are as artists. So I scheduled 3 dinners with the 50 artists I selected. I wound up photographing 58. And over 3 days, we did this dinner. And what I realized, that my idea of community that I thought was just going to continue on, or how I perceived it to be, was different. There was like differences, you know, amongst artists of color, and the way they responded to things. I think in my mind, I was still having a very, you know, kumbaya moments of thinking that we were all on the same page all the time, but it wasn't necessarily the case. And so that, you know, propelled me to continue with the dinners, more as a way to understand the why of that. So what you're looking at, this bottom picture, is the very first dinner. You can recognize some figures. There's Simone Lee, Jacoby Satterwhite, Guadalupe Maravilla, David Antonio Cruz, Jared Vadera. This is Fiorelli here, the back of her. And what I did was I invited Wanda Ramunde Ortiz to come in and be the provocateur in these dinners, to ask the tough questions that already was causing like a stir amongst the artists. And so these continued on for like 2 years, where the dinners kind of dealt with artists wanting to talk about agency, how they felt their place in the art world and in the world. But 2014 came, and that was the year of Mike Brown and Eric Garner. And that really switched and propelled the Supper Club to actually be more of a safe space, because people, I was finding, needed to grieve, people needed to express their anger, and people wanted to be in a space of like-minded individuals. And we really came together. And so in all these dinners, you know, I realized we were kind of on the same page. You know, I think when our ideas of agencies were different, but our ideas politically were the same. But again, it kind of harks back to like disco and the whole idea of finding or having those sanctuary spaces. I did like about 40 of those. I can go on and on, but I know we're like limited in time. I want to go back here. So the dinners were recorded, and the dinners were recorded. This is some of the later dinners that I did. And what was happening too with the dinners, as 2014 moved on, the dinners then became more about how people respond to political issues. So or how they respond to being a certain person or being a certain identity. So like in this one, this was a dinner with all women of color, and it was moderated by Brandy Summers, and it was representation, community, and communion. This one, the Black male. And this one was representation, the quotidian, and the radical consciousness of Black women. All the dinners were recorded, but there was hardly any, when I say recorded, I mean voice. There was no videotaping dinners. There was barely any pictures because I really wanted people to feel that they were comfortable. The dinners also were by invitation, and they were kind of curated to whatever discussion it is that we were having. And I did start to bring in hosts to kind of enlarge the group. We wound up having almost 600 participants in the course of like 6 years. It ultimately became a book with about 10 of those conversations along with the photographs. So here's an installation view of some of the photographs, and I'm just gonna just give a little description. This is Saya Wolfach, the myth maker. So one of the things when I wanted to photograph, I didn't want to, get the same background and photograph them. And then it's like, then it becomes about them being in my space. I wanted to think about what their practice was and make them an embodiment of that space and create them into these like archetypes. And aside from having the archetype, they would have a moniker. So they would be part of this constellation of artists that kind of came together to kind of talk about these own things. So it's a way of kind of the end project, which was the book, which I showed you the first cover, was really about, this idea of the persona, the politics, and the art in one. And that's, I think the photographs really kind of come across that way if you know the artist's work, like the myth maker. So here I created this like scenario. But another thing too that references the 70s was I referenced a lot of 70s imagery to create these photographs. So here you have Saya Wolfach, and this is like a nod to the funk band from the 70s, Aquarian Dream, where there's a cover of this woman in this kind of crazy looking jungle. I'm not going to explain every single one. I'm just going to go by. This is like Abigail DeVille as the pulsar. She doesn't use infrared lights, but she does talk about science and the solar system. So the pulsar, she talks a lot about black holes, but I couldn't call her the black hole. I thought that was too weird. Here's Jitra Ganesh. This is a nod to David Bowie, his Ziggy Stardust stage. Lorraine O'Grady is another nod to Andy Warhol's icon pictures of like Marilyn Monroe, not Marilyn, but yeah, well, Marilyn, Liz Taylor, and all this stuff. This is Clifford Owens. The Conduit, it's a nod to his performance piece, which I now can't remember the name. Juana Valdez, the Orisha. And so the point is for you to get a sense of what their artistic practice is about through the imagery. This is the Allegorist, David Antonio Cruz, Simone Lee, the Earth Seed, the Linguist, Brendan Fernandez. And I'm going to end here with the female gaze, Micheline Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elia. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, everybody. Unfortunately, Glendalis Medina is having technical issues and she won't be able to join us. It's been a bumpy day in terms of connectivity, but we're talking about community and connectivity, so we're compensating in the topics we are discussing for these technical issues. Thank you everybody. So I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to highlight how interesting it was that the three of you in very different ways talked about issues of representation and community, right? And how that affects on the individual, but also in the collective level, how it affects the representation of your own body, and how your body becomes a signifier, like Alicia was mentioning in her presentation. And I thought it was interesting to see that as part of a collective body in the experience of Elia Elba with the Super Club, the dinners, and this creation of community that we're all part of. At the same time, I wanted to ask you, taking upon a question that Arlene had crafted, and I hope I'm representing her question appropriately, but something that she highlighted as a prompt for this conversation was the multi-ethnic and racial communities that feel that feed, the Latin American and Latinx communities in New York, which is something that Alicia also mentioned. The privilege of New York, of being a place in which you grew up in this cosmopolitan ambiance, and at the same time, like the benefits and also difficulties that it brings for these bodies that are signifiers. And in relation to that, the internationalism that has always been present in Latinx social movements. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, I mean, with regards to your practices or also to your personal experiences.
Does anyone, is it in any order or?
No, however you feel inspired to.
Well, since I'm speaking already, I'll just continue talking. I grew up in Queens, and during that time, there was a big sort of media influx with hip hop culture, as well as MTV and the fast cuts, and just trying to make youth and culture accessible to the larger group. And it's really interesting because my parents were very traditional, and art was not considered a career path. It was considered something that you just enjoy doing on the side. So I grew up in as many children of immigrant parents, a space where education was the most important thing, and that's what was pushed no matter what. So I found myself sort of accessing and looking for mentors and looking for a connection to the larger New York City cultural groups and societies through my understanding of what that was. So I had cousins who were graffiti writers, and I also was really invested and interested in films, and I was totally inspired by the movie Fame and Beat Street and all of these sort of cultural indicators of what New York was supposed to be like, and how you get cultured in New York, and what Black and Brown people in New York City are into and what they do. So all that stuff made me gravitate towards an art school or leaders or mentors in art schools that were of color. And fortunately, I was able to meet Whitfield Lavelle in my undergrad career, and he has been sort of essential in having me tap into what the New York City cultural scene is. And I think that that's been the case ever since, even in graduate school. When I sought after and tried to find colleagues or a community, it was always through the vehicle of, from my experience, the academic vehicle. So wherever I would work, like I used to work at Cooper Union and teach at Hunter, but all those vehicles, I would always try to find a community of color, of brown people. And for the most part, it was always, my mentors, were Black men, because those were who was in these institutions, who I had access to and who were able to mentor me. So I think that influence and the idea of community came from their histories and their experiences, and the opportunities that they were offered or given, or they engendered through community. So I found myself really interested in sort of fostering those relationships that of people who felt really strongly about living a life of service. So it's why I still teach, and it's why I feel strongly about a commitment to being also working with the mayor's office as a public design commissioner, because I feel like that's something that is a duty, as well as sharing and contributing.
I wonder if you might be able to repeat the question, because I'm totally.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, I hope that I am repeating it correctly, but basically, I wanted to bring up two of the questions that Arlene had set as prompts for this conversation. And the two of them were highlighting different aspects of how New York is a multicultural, like multi-ethnic racial communities that are part of, of New York in general, but specifically also of the Latinx communities and movements in New York and in the US. And also, she wanted to see how that affected your production. And she also talked, which I thought would be interested to relate in the answers, about the internationalism that has characterized, and has been present in Latinx social movements historically. That is something that is very present in the exhibition, but I think it's also present in some discussions today about the idea of what is Latinx. So yes.
Yeah. I kind of, when I think about like Latin America, I don't really connect to it in that way, in the sense of, and then of course it's the Caribbean. The Caribbean wants to be its own country, like its own region. And I think to some degree it is, it's different. Like the Spanish speaking Caribbean versus like South America, even though we all speak Spanish. So I think when I think about this, like, but again, when I think about these, in particular these dinners, and I talk about how in those early dinners, how people were not, especially those first three dinners, there was a little bit of tension, not bad tension, because as people left the dinner, they were like, wow, that was just great to say that. But I also, as I've gone into the dinners, I realized this is really Latin America, this multi-ethnic group of people that we want to bring together, to try to form something in some kind of sense of, I mean, that's the debate about calling Latinx, right? There's always a debate of people feeling that it's stripping away identities. But when I think about that dinner, I think about those dinners that I did throughout, people can be different, but still fall under the umbrella of Latinx, and still fall under the umbrella, people of color, however you want to do it. Because I think sometimes, when we think of someone who is not maybe who's a white Latino, let's just say it just like that, might still, clearly the privilege of the skin is there, but might still be confronted with other things because of language, because of a heavy accent, because you just don't look like you belong here. I mean, my son is fair. And when he was in college, they would tell me, you look like you're white in the dark, just to give you a sense of how sometimes this whole idea of race is kind of really racial. It's like, they are levels, So this multi-Latino thing, or this multi-experience, it is part of what it is to be Latinx, or at least I think that's what we're trying to do. And I can only say it now after doing so many dinners, that when I look at that project, I really think that project is really about what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us as Latinos? Even though I feel very connected, sometimes more to when I, growing up here, to the African-American community than I did with my Latino counterparts, with the exception of the Puerto Ricans that were already here and were already very Black identified. And I think a lot of it had to do with like privileges in class, or maybe just not having the same kind of access. Because, my parents came here in the 50s. They came here during the era of Trujillo. And so, those families over there had money to send them over, because you just couldn't leave the country if you didn't have the money, or if you didn't have certain kinds of access and privilege. But, when they came here, effectively, my father will tell you, I became a Black man when I came to this country. And that just then created other allegiances, just to be able to survive. So that, too, like those, that's another thing that plays into the dinners, this idea of, you know, when my parents came here, the Dominican community was this small. So it was that small and some Puerto Ricans, because Puerto Ricans had been here for a while. But then, you know, I think about the project by Gordon Matta Clark, Food. And it was definitely coming from that place of trying to find a space for artists, many of them who were Latin American, because él lo era, you know, he was that. A space to be able to just to eat, because as I mentioned in my presentation, as art was thriving, you know, art seems to thrive when we're in the worst of times. I don't understand. The 80s too, you know, during AIDS, like all this, it's like a hotbed for creativity, but that doesn't take away from, you know, the inequities that were existing, even for those that came from privilege. I can't assume that all these artists, you know, they were able to came, you know, with wads of cash. I'm sure they had to hustle to kind of try to fit in or find their groups to come together. So yeah. So when I think of these two projects, I think about a lot about community. Well, it's the ideas of community and how communities come together and how that looks, what that looks like, whether we wear a mask and we all look the same, or whether I photograph you differently and we're clearly different, that there's no identity of the photographer. It's really about the identity. It's all part of my investigation. I'm really interested in that in that particular human condition.
Thank you so much, Elia. And Alicia, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I'll keep it brief. Brief from my observations growing up in New York City, just being an incredibly special place within the United States. It's unlike other cities in the country, although its suburbanization due to gentrification has been violently changing it in ways that are becoming unfamiliar to me. But one of the things that lent itself for in regards to the question to the moment of internationalism that Arlene is referring to, I think that anyone who comes from a recent immigrant family, right? Because as only Indigenous people and African American people can really call are not immigrants. But for those of us who, for recent generations, have that tie to different places, it's very natural for us to start thinking of the world outside of this, because there's always conversation about quote unquote back home. There's always a different perspective being brought in when we're talking about a common point in history. For example, Columbus's arrival. You will get, or not arrival, we all know it was an invasion, but nonetheless, that point in 1492 it's a very different perspective when spoken about at home, when you are from families from the Western Hemisphere, than with families who might be able to trace their lineages more directly to Western Europe. It's a very different dialogue in that moment in history. So the expansion of our horizons have always been broader in that sense, because there's always a different perspective to come in when looking at the center point, for example, and in history just being one of them. And I think that coming from families or communities where immigration, no matter where in the world you're from, that's always been an advantage point. And it's a place where New York City nurtures that, because it is a port city. Just geographically speaking, New York City it's a port city. It's because of its beginnings, although violent, you know, the Dutch, having established the East India Company here in New York City, tried to establish a very similar circumstance. So since the very beginning, you had those trade routes along with the people coming from the Caribbean up into New York City. And the Caribbean itself being a point where many different people from all around the world, again, we're tying in those similar trade routes from all around the world. And that just lent itself naturally to come to New York City just due to its geographical location. So I think growing up here, having a more international, I'm awkward with the word cosmopolitan. Sometimes it lends itself to a type of hierarchy that I'm not aligned with. But internationalism, I do align with that much more due to these very brief, and I'm sorry if they're rough explanations as to how I'm describing New York City, but in essence, fundamentally, I think that these contribute to our ability, having been born and grown up here, to really just think outside of our spaces. And you see that in the communities themselves. You know, it's going to Chinatown, it's going to Flushing, it's having these little networks of places, whether it's going to the East Bronx, where it's a more feckin' English-speaking Caribbean community, whether it's going to Curry Hill or to its equivalent in Jackson Heights. I mean, there are these different networks, or visiting Little Palestine and Bay Ridge. Like, there are these different, they're part of the city in such a way, and the people move throughout it. And it's not to negate difficulties moving about in the city, being either an immigrant or a person of color or a person that is not conforming to heterosexual patriarchal standards of being in the world.
And can I just add one more thing to that, Alicia, is that, there is this greater historical connection between not just the Caribbean, but that experience, Latin America, South America, Mexico, but also the history of revolution, specifically the Haitian Revolution, and how it influenced Ecuador and Colombia and Venezuela and the Americas and South America. But also, I was really inspired by the Monarchs exhibition that I participated in a couple of years ago, and it spoke specifically to the migrants of the new indigenous people that come here, but also the historical connection between North American indigenous communities of the Americas, along all of the Americas, and how there were, prior to colonization, these communities had a way to share, to exchange, and our histories, including the history of slavery, is much more similar than we talk about. And it's just the only thing that is, not the only thing, but one of the things that sort of divides that history is the fact that we don't talk to each other. I mean, there are different colonial languages, from English to Spanish to French to Portuguese, but there's a similar historical connection, and this of people being the genocide and slavery, and people having to have forced migration at different points of history. And like New York City, New Orleans has this really great history of the same people, Spanish people, French people. And I think that's what we have to sort of, as artists or as cultural practitioners, understand, that history is not something that we're privy to when we're in New York, and if we are raised or grow up in public school system, we don't have that history accessible to us. You kind of have to search for it, but those histories that combined history is more connected to our ancestry and to our lived experience than we actually know. So it's something that we should consider and to value more.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic to Chia, who has a question also, and who will be reading some questions from the audience.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all these presentations. It was amazing to see how different all your practices are in terms of media and issues that they tackle, but at the same time, there are so many commonalities. I have a question to Alicia, and I'm thinking about the difference between your performance works and your photographs, you know, how you being a performance, like the presence of your body and how your performance and your body are directly implicating the viewer, asking them to making decisions, to looking or not at you. And then the difference of the image itself, you know, the photograph, the documentation of that performance. To what extent do you think those images also serve the purpose to dislocate the colonial gaze of the white, you know, male hetero viewer, and also the colonial space of the museum itself and the art institutions that circulate those performances? But I think my question is about how you display these documentations and how do they exist after the performances? And can I ask, sorry, should I ask a question to Mary or because I know we're short on time?
I think it's okay if we let Alicia respond first. And if I might join in, I just want to point out that Benorra had a related question to yours in the chat, in which she's also like questioning something similar, not so much about documentation, but she was asking Alicia to also expand on how she gives others the power to move her in, you know, the type of interaction that she promotes in her performance. So maybe she can combine both responses.
I will do my best. Persevere. Let's see. And thank you for clarifying that, because one of my follow-up questions to you, Dia, was, you know, or you're referring to the documentation, but yes, it's the documentation, my work that you saw. How does that exist within the archive of the museum in itself, and how does that undo the gaze? Or in that process, because I alone cannot do that. I mean, I think that fundamentally, part of my work continues on with whoever the gazer is. I mean, for me, I view particularly, and this is particularly to image making and photography, the dialogue continues after when you take a photograph or you do a video. It doesn't end with the making of that video or that photograph for me. It needs the gazer. It needs the gazer to add onto it. And many times we will not know what that gazer will be thinking once they go home onto themselves. But I do hope, as an artist, as an image maker, that the wheels have been turned somewhat in the questioning of how they're looking, what has made them look in the manner that they're looking, what ideas are the ones that pop into their mind and how they got there. And I think that in particular my self-portrait work, it's you know, there's a tradition of returning the gaze. You know, when you return the gaze back, you know how they say in film, you're breaking the fourth wall. You're looking at the viewer and engaging them in a dialogue about what is occurring, and what's occurring in the space of the image, and also what's occurring in the space of the exchange. So the documentation of my work, I mean, more pragmatically speaking, it's something that I work with curators. We work through that together when I have exhibited the documentation of my work. That's the fun part of documenting performances, because it's also what lives on. You can never replace the lived experience of witnessing a live performance with the documentation. It can never be replaced. But then the documentation has to, at some moment, recapture the essence of what has remained. And yes, that's where a lot of the semiotic ideas come in. And that's where like the editing of the photos of which ones are going to be it. And in large part, that dialogue ensues with the curator when exhibiting it. In regards to, and I hope I answered that question fully. If not, you can follow up if we have time. And then in regards to the question from the chat, the instructions are very basic, if you will. I try not to make them too complicated because it's easier that way, but it's also easier to facilitate because I'm not the one facilitating. I'm unable to facilitate. I'm purposeful about that because I don't want to engage in an art conversation or a functional conversation with the participants. I want them to be engaging with me as this shell, as this human being, and not as, artist in, where we're going to sit down and talk about concepts, which occurs, or which could occur. I kind of stopped that by disabling my communication skills and really relying on others to be the intermediaries. So the instructions themselves are kept very basic. For example, in Say Her Name, my assistants had pieces of paper with just the person's name on it. For example, just like Sandra Bland on a sheet of paper, someone would come up and say, "What's going on?" There's this woman walking down the street with a plant on her head. And, my assistants would briefly explain, this is what was occurring and if they would like to participate. And once they consented to participating, they would be handed a paper and just told instructions. You have to get her to the other side. You have to help her get to the other side, and just guide her through. And it's really a fascinating activity because I can always hear. So I'm always paying attention, and that's the one sense that is always present. And I can hear either the exchange of the instructions, or I can hear how people kind of naturally step into that role. And then that's where free will comes in, the free will to guide, and how that shows up in a manner that is very different with each individual. And to be honest, everyone who's participated has done it with such immense care because they understand what's occurring. It's not something that has to be overly explained. People just get the situation, and that's really the beautiful thing about it. And that's what, in many parts, this performance is trying to get to the heart of, right? Because we strip ourselves of our own humanity, no matter what side of the gaze you're on, and it's about getting in touch with that again in order for us to start dismantling the structure.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I want to move to a question to Mary that I had, and then I'm so glad that my colleague Horacio also asked a question that is related. So my question is, and this panel is about the contemporary legacy of the 70s, right? So like, in what ways do you see your practice disconnected or connected to this legacy of white American, sorry, not American, white Latin American artists who embraced abstraction that was inspired by pre-colonial art? For example, from Torres Garcia in the early part of the century to more recently in the 1970s, Alejandro Puente or Cesar Paternoster. So how you are engaging or modifying this history? And then Horacio, he asks, can you say more about the dialogue you established with a cultural heritage that is distant both in time and in space, such as the Inca? While contemporary artists based in the Andes who appropriate pre-Columbian past are often framed by nationalist discourse or ideology, your approach to cultural heritage has other implications, and I would like to hear more about it.
That's a great question. Thank you. I guess it's different because there's the sense of wanting to not just romanticize or revisit the ideal sort of nostalgia of being indigenous, or what those sort of visual cues are. I think in terms of my personal ancestry and history, there was a historical disconnect, not just in New York, coming to New York, but before that. My family has their roots, or my father's family has their roots in the Andes, but then his mother was forced to migrate to the coast, to Guayaquil. She knew how to speak Quechua. My dad never learned. He spoke Spanish because he was part of the sort of their port city, their hub, Guayaquil. So because of what was happening in politics and South America and many countries during the 70s and the economic crash, he was forced to migrate to, again to New York. So there was this sort of larger distance in between the originators of the visual language and culture. It's my, it was always like my dream to learn how to speak Quechua again, but it's been really difficult. I have 3 sons and I have, very busy upbringing. And so I never had a chance to really focus on actually learning the language as fluidly as my grandmother knew it. But I think because Quechua lends itself to, it was more of it was not originally a written language, it was a spoken language, and people share their histories and their knowledge through verbal histories and not necessarily written. It was really easy for the language and the history and the understanding of the cultural cues to be dismissed or to be erased, because there was no sort of academic record of it. There were even records that were pre-Columbian and Incan, were like the Quipu system, were actually stolen from by many museums, and they were, or destroyed, because they did basically what it was an archival system of exchanges and goods and land ownership and well, not really ownership, but land cultivation, and that was the only way to sort of claim this is our land, we're from here. And it was a way for the Spanish to sort of erase that proof. So for me, looking back when I was young and we would go to Ecuador all the time, and I had the opportunity to go to not just the coast, but also to Otavalo and Quito and Baños and different areas in Ecuador. I think there was always a connection, a wanting to sort of reach back and make those connections more viable, to claim my culture, my roots, because a lot of that was through forced colonization, through, sometimes rape, sometimes, forced, having that sort of Spanish connection was supposed to be a vehicle to a more acceptable and accessible space in Latin America, but specifically my family in Ecuador. So having that last name meant it would be easier for you to participate in culture and go to university and get certain jobs, which was sort of debunked when you come to the States, because that last name doesn't mean anything anymore, right? So to me, it's been an opportunity to sort of look at the legacy of violence, of rape, of erasure, and try to reestablish that language, to bring it up by researching and studying the visual culture and material culture of my ancestors, and position that as something that is viable and something that's valuable, and to try to reconnect with contemporary work. And that way, which I've learned through going to university in the States and going to graduate school at Penn, to sort of like, which actually holds some of the largest collections of quipus, which I found out when I was there. And making that language viable again, that visual language viable again through the research and through the making of, the utilizing of those patterns and codes and rhythms.
Thank you very much. Aimé.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Mary, Elia, Alicia, and to Arlene, who I hope can at least hear the recording after, for setting up this wonderful roundtable. It was wonderful to hear your experience. And thank you, Glendalis. We hope that we can hear you next time. We're sorry for the difficulties. We are going to take a lunch break now. We're going to resume the conference at 2 p.m. You may, at your preference, stay logged in and disconnect, or disconnect and log back at 2 p.m. for, we're going to start at 2 p.m. sharp for part 2 of the conference today. Here is the program in the screen. We will leave it on. And again, thank you everybody for joining.